Hi, my name is Jason T. Ingram. I'm a multimedia artist and mental health activist with the stage name of Fake Zappa. I'm from the Pacific Northwestern part of the United States, and currently I'm living in a travel trailer with my partner, two dogs, a crazy cat, in Central Oregon. And I like to talk about fake and cheap forms of mental health here in the United States and also abroad. It seems like America exports a lot of things, and one of those is our healthcare models, which are cheapening more and more. Mental health should not be an industry. It should just be something that people need and they can easily get, and that'll reduce violent crime. And I'm sure that's pretty obvious to most people, although we do a lot to seem to provide support for people after the crimes are committed. But if we do things that are preventative, especially because there's this addiction to power and abuse of power more and more when it comes to forms of hyper-capitalism, which I'm not so opposed of, just as long as the people that are in charge don't have a lot of political power to take advantage of underprivileged people, which is typically what happens when you get folks that are really working a lot to try to get as much power as they can and influence over people. And this is a demographic of very easily influential people, and we need a lot of help and a lot of support. And my experience is every year or two, it seems to be harder and harder to access mental health services, especially ones that are adequate. And the stuff that's available out there from different organizations that provide things that look and sound like mental health, however, they could actually do more harm than good. So I've noticed talking to some folks in the United Kingdom where I've been getting a lot of vocational support for my work and my activism. It seems to be that this system that's going on right now that is making our middle class disappear and is making folks that are powerful get more powerful and rich that are more rich. And of course, we see those that are suffering on the bottom more and more, which causes prolonged exposure to unsafe environments, which causes more trauma, which causes more mental health issues. And it's a downward spiral that leads to homelessness and all kinds of other social ills that we could easily prevent if we were to make mental health safe and affordable and accessible, especially towards men, because men, most of the time, especially working class type men, don't feel safe in those environments. We don't seem to put a lot of effort into making them feel safe. We do a lot of effort to try to get the providers to protect themselves from perceived threats of what they think men are going to do that live with mental illness. For me, luckily, I've never had any legal issues with it. I do have a history of mood disorders, personality disorders, psychotic stuff, and it has made my life almost unbearable and very difficult to really do anything. So this is the long version. I have a short version as well. So if you don't mind 30 minutes of talking about the US and the UK, especially when it has to do with men and mental illness, I'll talk a little bit about more of what I've dealt with when it comes to cognitive disorders and mood disorders and things like that. Is there's a mix of ADHD, PTSD, GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, and also I've been diagnosed with different forms of bipolar disorder, and especially, and this is one I've been dealing with the last 5 years, is panic attacks, and how hard that is to treat, to prevent, and to live with, and to cope with, and how debilitating that can be. And when it comes to depression, and when it comes to panic attacks, men, I think, in my experience, and especially from what I go through, we seem to cope with it differently. We express it differently, and I think it's harder to identify, to diagnose, and to treat, especially when it's so easy to cover up. And a lot of times men express depression as anger, because anger is a fear of losing control. When you're losing your mind, when you lose your drive, when you lose your sex drive and your drive to live and to even do things that are fun, that scares you. You don't know what's going on. It doesn't make sense. And you try to do all these things and try to get more pleasure, to think that maybe I'll feel pleasure if I just indulge in it, or if I try to control everything. And if I can't control everything, that's where the anger comes in. I'm going to force it to happen. And so a lot of times when people see an angry man, they want to protect themselves. And when they're afraid of an angry man, then a lot of it is a perceived threat. Because when folks see rage, especially when you're dealing with like clinical, educated type folks, instead of making the man feel safe, they try to protect themselves. And when they go into fear mode, then what's happening is you've got two people that are in a fight or flight type situation, but unfortunately, one is in power and one is not. And the one that's likely to lose control of his temper and with out of control rage is the peer. The peer, I mean somebody who's living with mental illness and who, whether they know it or not, they need treatment, they need help. And unfortunately, just because of what's inside of them, whether they really express it or not, or whether they even do any harm to anybody, they're treated like a criminal. So what I'm saying here is losing your mind is not a crime. It's just that when it goes unchecked for a long time, and especially when somebody is put in unsafe environments or everybody's trying to protect themselves from this perceived threat, whether this person has done anything violent or not, that person is treated like a criminal, whether they've done anything to harm or even scare somebody or not. And here's a side note, and I've talked about this before, is that you walk into a mental health clinic and it seems like there is a demographic of people who seem to be more in tune and more accepting of mental health issues. And I honestly think, in my experience, that women don't cover up their mental health issues like men do so much. Men have an easier time and are more prone to being in denial. So I'm thinking, if we were to make our environments in the mental health industry, whether it's business or government or nonprofit, and it's not just putting guy stuff in the lobby, it's just having an awareness and a preparedness in order to deal with certain types of men with a different type of need. And instead, the only type of guys that seem to feel safe in those environments are guys that came from my background, the urban, educated, sensitive, new age guy type thing. We're accustomed to sharing our feelings and all that kind of stuff. But when you're dealing with working class men, especially those with more of a biblical or a traditional ideology, and they go into this environment and they see pictures of women suffering and videos of women talking about self-care, and they see all this stuff from Eastern religions, and they see all this very like wordy stuff that comes from the intellectual educated community when it comes to cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and all these other therapies. And you get this guy, he's like, hey, I'm just scared I'm losing my mind and I don't know what to do. And then, of course, there's anger management. And, you know, what they try to do is they try to control a guy who's angry. And that's the last thing you want to do to somebody who feels scared that they're losing control of themselves. So what I see is a lack of empowerment when it comes to men. And especially, there's something I've heard about, you know, different priorities that men and women tend to have when it comes to making decisions. For instance, like, you know, what kind of company am I going to hire for this or that? If there's one thing that men seem to hate, it's hassle. We hate a lot of hassle. We want to just walk into a store, get a beer, buy it, drink it. You know? We don't have to go through all of this stuff in order to just basically either get our needs met or our wants met. And unfortunately, it's becoming more and more difficult because of the cheapening industry that mental health has become. And in the United States, it sounds very similar to what they do in the United Kingdom and a lot of places in England. If you're in crisis, they just do a stabilization thing. They might give you 6 weeks of sessions and then poof, they just let you go. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to like either bend the truth or even make up something. If you're suffering and you're not severe enough to be hurting yourself or others or thinking about that, most of the time they won't do anything for you unless you make them feel like you're some kind of threat. And then it's like, oh gosh. And then when that happens, yes, you might get care. You might have better access to care. You might get immediate care if you make them feel like you're threatening harm to yourself or others. Unfortunately, what you get is a lot of control. In fact, if they're going to hospitalize you, typically they won't accept you no matter how bad you're suffering, just to get you in a safe place to heal and to recover and to restore. Maybe get some skills and maybe try to process some stuff in order for you to get back on your feet. That rarely happens. In fact, there are some places where they have a crisis respite center, and those are becoming less and less available. So what happens if you're suffering a whole bunch, chances are you won't get help. But if you are, or you make them have the impression that you're some kind of threat to yourself or others, then chances are you will be a priority and you'll get help. And the drawback, one, is of course, and I've had to do this before, I had to lie to get into a mental hospital years ago, and that wasn't fair to me, and I refused to do that again. And it's gotten me to where I'm not allowed to get into the psych ward unless I lie about my condition. Now here's the thing, is that if you tell a worker or a mandatory reporter or some type of person that's processing people to get into some type of residential care or outpatient care, whatever it is, and if they feel like, whether you are or not, a threat to yourself or a threat to others, especially minors, then yes, you will have more of a priority and a privilege to get immediate care. The problem is, you're on lockdown. They will lock you up in there until they feel like you're not a threat anymore. And that gets really interesting when you're there and you're like, well, I'm not a threat, I just needed help. And then they try to get you out of there as soon as possible, and that's usually based on your insurance. And that's something that we suffer with in the United States, is all these healthcare companies. And some of these healthcare giants, these chains, sometimes they're a coastal chain, sometimes they're a national chain, or they're regional, whatever it is they will offer their own insurance program with their network, with their quacks that are in their system. Or you'll have, these big health insurance companies that'll have their preferred providers and stuff. Well, when you're on Medicare and you deal with one of these, you don't get anything preferred. You get the bottom of the barrel. You get the Craigslist type practitioners, not the Angie's List, for lack of a better term. And then when it comes to mental health, unless you have this amazing golden insurance, or you're going to pay out of pocket, you can't find a therapist, or you have to make all of these calls, and the hassle is unbelievable. And it gets worse every time I have to advocate for myself or somebody else to find a psychotherapist, and it's even more difficult to find a med provider, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a psychiatrist. And chances are you'll get stuck with a company that's sort of like a modern day, barely legal drug dealer that's giving people, phone consulting to send them, controlled substances like benzodiazepines and amphetamines and stuff that these med providers do. And they don't care about your mental health. And I've had to deal with some of these groups, and they are horrible. They should be shut down. They should be investigated. But unfortunately, if someone's on Medicare, they don't have the privilege of getting a reputable provider. And if they do, they have to wait a long time. And with the main Medicare provider here in the region where I live, you have to either be on a waiting list, or the last time I contacted them, they were so overwhelmed they didn't even have a waiting list. There was like a wait to get on the waiting list. And then you wait several months. And then you have to sit with a therapist all that time in order for them to decide whether you're going to get a med provider or not. And then you don't know who you're going to get. And in order to switch providers, you have to do it through your current provider. And that's a terrible system, especially if you're with a provider who is abusive. And a lot of folks that end up at these government jobs that are lower paying and that have better job security are folks that are very disreputable, that just flow below the radar and are able to keep these jobs in these positions. And they do a lot of harm to a lot of peers, and they don't listen to them. And they're influenced more by drug companies than they are by the people's needs. And the drug companies have an amazing hold on folks. It is amazing. You could sit there and take a little questionnaire that's a page or two, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes of you sitting there with a psychiatrist, and boom, they will diagnose you and medicate you within a very short time without any kind of stabilization, without even looking at paperwork to see what your diagnosis is. They just experiment on people most of the time. They call it a cocktail when they say, we're going to put you on this med and this med and this med, we're going to try it out. And then we'll adjust those, and maybe we'll give you another pill to counteract the side effects of this pill. And so that kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. What's changing now is that it's cheapening. It's ever cheapening, especially when it comes to one-on-one counseling, psychotherapy. You don't have to meet with a PhD, although a lot of these folks are PhDs, and they charge, $200 to $300 an hour, and most of that is coming from government funds or subsidized. And my copay is $40, and luckily I can afford that. But if I was just making what most people make on disability, I couldn't afford those copays. Most people that I know that are on Social Security disability cannot even afford to see a psychotherapist. A psychotherapist here in the States is like a luxury item. It's something for busy, stressed out, urban educated people, because over the last generation or two, it's actually kind of cool to be seeing a therapist. That means that, oh, you're working on, your self-care and your personal growth. And, when you're dating somebody, years ago, it was really like, oh my God, I don't want to date this man or woman because they're seeing a shrink. And now it's like, oh, that's kind of a good thing, because then maybe we could get couples counseling, or they might be open to that. And it's amazing the kind of high-functioning people that see a therapist, and they'll see the same therapist for like 5 or 10 years or more. And I think how lucky they are to do that. And one of my closest friends, who is at about the same functioning level as me, but has a lot of physical problems in addition to that, doesn't even see a therapist. Can't even afford that. Can't even afford the copays for that, because that's $40 a week, and that really adds up. And so it's amazing how out of balance this thing is. And one of the things that I notice about the cheapening healthcare industry when it comes to mental health is the one-on-one stuff is very expensive, very time-consuming, and if it's subsidized, they don't want people who are suffering and who are poor to get that type of one-on-one long-term care. And that's what's going on in the UK as well. And what I see happening is that they just think as long as they can put us in groups and do group therapy, and most of the time the facilitators aren't good, at controlling that environment. And that's another story. But group therapy is usually, somebody dominating the conversation or whatever, or just sitting in this bath of communal negativity and really not getting anywhere. Occasionally you learn some skills and things from others. I've had some good support groups, but most of them are counterproductive and typically led by folks who you wonder why they're there, because they want a lot of control over that environment. And those are the ones that I avoid, because you realize that this somebody is addicted to power, or they're abusing power, and they're in these volunteer environments and they feel entitled to have a lot of influence over people who are vulnerable. When they're in crisis, they're vulnerable. When they're low functioning, they're vulnerable. Easy to control. And this attracts a lot of very toxic people to volunteer or to work, especially if they're getting underpaid or they're volunteering. They feel entitled to have a lot of power over a lot of people who are very vulnerable, who can't speak up for themselves. Because when you're crazy and you try to complain about somebody who's powerful, it is unlikely that you will be heard and really considered and even acknowledged in those situations. So what happens here is not only the group therapy thing is cheap, and sometimes it works, and I've had good ones and bad ones. It just should not replace individual therapy. The other thing that they try to do, and this might be a good thing for folks that are from the sort of working class community, is to just educate the hell out of them. Now, if you're coming out of a mental hospital and you're new to self-care and you're new to this stabilization thing, or even if they're teaching the recovery model instead of the treatment model, which I think is a good step, and all this stuff about self-care, as long as it's not spooky to somebody and it works, then that's great. But what happens once somebody is educated and they know enough about self-care, and they know enough about how their brain works, or whatever it is that they're teaching in these mental health coping skills classes? What happens when you know enough? And it's also a problem when folks are overeducated about something, then they feel like they've accomplished something when really they just got a head full of knowledge. And really, you don't need a lot of education to take care of yourself. It's more about applying what you learn. And in order to do that, you need a motivating environment. You need people that are going to empower you to do these things and not feel like you're cornered to do these things, especially when it comes to mandatory mental health, when it comes to folks that get in legal problems as a result of an untreated or undiagnosed mental illness, or prolonged exposure to unsafe environments, especially when there's vulnerable people around. And especially when it comes to men who are sent to anger management and involuntarily locked up for some reason, and it typically makes them even worse. And this is pretty obvious. We've known this for a long time. So what we need is individualized care. What we need is, instead of cutting corners financially, we need to invest enough time and effort and finances to make sure folks are getting their needs met. It should be results oriented. And I have one provider that they didn't really care what was going on in the therapy room. And I think they were abusive to their employees, because their employees were really abusive to the clients. So you'd fill out a questionnaire each time. Well, I decided that, this provider was abusive, really, really bad. And so I put negative marks on the multiple choice section of the questionnaire about the last session. Well, this provider got really nervous and really started doing their job for one session. And then the next session would go back to being abusive, and then I would complain, and then the provider would get all nervous and, okay, I better treat this person with some respect today. And that was weird. That was really weird. Now, that doesn't happen with everywhere that I go. However, it's pretty sad that those folks were, um, I don't know if their employees were getting paid much, but one of the things was is they had somebody who was really gifted at leading classes, and that was their position. And they would transfer them to do individual therapy and vice versa. And so you'd get somebody who's teaching a class and they were horrible at it. And I'm the worst person to have in your class because I had been a teacher. So I sit there and I'd be like, okay, they've never learned how to run a classroom. And I'm sitting here trying to learn. and oh boy. And I've learned to keep my mouth shut when it comes to things that nobody's going to listen to me. And you know what? I haven't learned my lesson. I decided that I'm going to just not keep my mouth shut anymore. And no matter how much it harms me and my reputation, whatever it is, I'm going to speak my truth about my experiences in this mental health industry. And like I said, it shouldn't be an industry. Because what really, really got me motivated wasn't just seeing all this violent crime going on, especially in the Western world. And it really had to do with men and mental health issues. And they're trying to blame it on, you know, firearms and access to dangerous things. And then you got folks that just drive a truck through a crowd. And, you know, so are they going to outlaw cars? I mean, it's just getting to be so unbelievable. And there's a lot of crazy going on, especially in the Western world. And there's a lot of power going up and not a lot of people being empowered. And I think a lot of that crazy is just being passed on generation, and it has to stop, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And I think with the powerful getting more powerful, we got this disappearing middle class, and it's making people go crazy, especially folks that had privileges, and they lose those privileges, and they're mad because they see, you know, people that were underprivileged. And it's typically not the case, but they might see, let's say, one person of color, and they feel like that person is getting too much attention and they're being ignored, and it makes them mad, and it makes them want to act out in violence. And so what affected me wasn't just seeing all this violent crime on the news, it was my reaction to it. I got used to violent crime. I got used to seeing this on the news. I got numb to this, and that's what scared me. And I said, I need to start speaking out and come up with some ideas that are totally outside of the box. And I've got some other videos about that are longer and even more ranting. And so anyways, the United States and the United Kingdom, we export, you know, a lot of evangelical stuff, a lot of very cheap corporate models, and that goes all over the world. And yeah, we've always known that. It's just that when it comes to healthcare, I don't think we have a lot of awareness on where healthcare is going, especially mental health care. And what happens if mental health care just keeps getting more cheap and cheap, and it gets more difficult for men to feel safe and to get access to care? We're going to see a lot of crazy going on.